It's high time for some tradition. Hello and welcome back to Meet Mozart. I'm Angie, that's Mozart, and today we're diving into a pretty complex subject, which is we're going to be taking a look at how Jewish music and Western classical music have influenced each other throughout the years. Now, most of the time on this channel, whenever we're choosing a subject to talk about, it's because either we think there might be a question or we've actually heard from the audience that they have a question regarding a particular subject and we want to shed a little bit of light onto it. But in this case, this is actually a question that I have had, and I wanted to dig in and seek some further information. Of course, there are many different cultures that have influenced classical Western music in various ways throughout the years. But unlike most other cultures where that interaction had to happen because someone sailed an ocean blue or developed an elaborate trade route, Judaism has always been a present subculture within Western culture for as long as what we think of as modern Western culture has existed. So it seemed highly unlikely to me that these two cultures could be living in such proximity to one another and not have some elements of crossover in between. So we just wanted to dig in and discover what was there. Of course, this is a subject with a lot of girth and complexity, and so in order to help us sort of sift through it, I've invited Dina Pruzhansky, a Russian-Israeli-American composer, to join us and give us some of her insights and perspective on the subject. Dina and I met many years ago, back when I was doing my master's in school, and I've had the great honor of performing in two productions of her opera Shulamit, which is a production that is based off of texts from Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes. But Dina's body of work has covered a lot of different genres, and she's composed everything from musical theater to opera, art song, and even liturgical pieces that are presented in Jewish temples. I'm so thrilled to get to have Dina here and to hear her thoughts and perspective on this really vast subject. And of course, being what it is, even if we had a lifetime and access to every single historical resource that ever existed, we would still be left with a million thoughts and questions. So our hope is that through this conversation, we can pinpoint some really pertinent moments in which these two cultures came together musically. And for that to be a launching point for you to continue your own discovery. If you have more questions, there's more things you want to learn about. And I have included a list of references in the description below to help you do that. So if we touch on something and you want to know more, check that list and you might be able to find out a little bit more and dive a little deeper. So without further ado, please welcome Dina Pruzhansky. Hi Dina, welcome to Meet Mozart.
Hi Angie, thank you for having me, and it's great to reconnect with you again.
Yeah, it's been a minute.
After the
The last time we saw each other was probably before the pandemic and a little while before then.
and on stage, at
Yeah.
least for you, right?
Yes, working
In
on opera.
yes, yeah, on my Hebrew Shulamit out of all things, yeah.
Yeah, which was great.
So,
And we're going to get to hear some music from a little bit later in our discussion too, which is awesome.
okay.
Yeah. So, well, thank you so much for joining us because this is like a pretty huge topic that we've decided to take on. So I'm really glad to get like your perspective and your experience and kind of learn how these two cultures, how Western culture and Jewish culture have sort of influenced each other musically throughout time. So, and that's going to kind of be our trajectory for this conversation is kind of looking at chronologically how they've interacted with one another through the years, and then of course ending with your experiences and getting to hear some music from you as well.
Well, I'm honored to be part of this huge landscape, and that is quite an undertaking to talk about Jewish music, just because of how it of the historical context in which it developed. There's no, it's much more complicated than to say, okay, this is France and this is French music. When you talk about Jewish music, you talk about the people who were dispersed for a few thousand years and developed different musical traditions that are both influenced by the localities they were, but also developed a distinct flavor, a Jewish flavor of the place they were at the time. So this is a big one to take on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. And I think, it was interesting kind of looking at, other cultures as well and how they were integrating that even within like the Western traditions, of course, we've got French, we've got German, and all these various different things that are, evolving in their own space. But yeah, it's interesting how in Judaism, they're feeding off of each other, and yet there's this central line. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. Like, what is, if you had to say, Jewish music is all of these things that are hard to describe, what would be the kind of common denominators that bring them together, both in terms of the musical tradition in Judaism, as well as like some of the musical elements that you see throughout?
Well, I think I wouldn't make it as a scholarly statement, but rather as a subjective opinion. If I would try and think of what makes Jewish music distinct, or Jewish folk music distinct, as far away as it might seem stylistically and throughout the time, I think it is more in the kind of dual nature of Jewish music. For example, I mean that there's never, for example, a tune that is purely happy, right? As joyful and wonderful and upbeat as you could have a Jewish dance music or a song, you will hear there's an extra dimension to it. There's always like a tinge of sadness maybe to it, or a tinge of something tragic, and vice versa. You could have the most tragically perceived melody, and there is a glimpse of hope in that. And I think this is what probably the character, the multidimensionality of the character, the kind of a duality that probably derives from the Jewish experience itself,
right?
Especially in the diaspora. I think this is the common ground that can be found, and I think this is also something that probably was appealing to many Western composers, concert music composers, right? When Max Bruch, not being Jewish, took Kol Nidre, the authentic Jewish prayer, to set it into his concert piece for cello and orchestra, I think he was drawn to that ambiguity and this mystical sense of melody. Same with Shostakovich. Shostakovich called Jewish music the music of the defenseless one. And being a great humanist as he was, I think he was drawn to the fact that the joy can turn in a second into a grotesque, and tragedy could bring joy in it, right, in a certain way.
Right. And this is something that is, I think, of course, it comes from the fact that, Jewish people have been dispersed throughout the world. I think there's an element of, even when you're happy, there's always this yearning, right, for a homeland and things of that nature that are a palpable quality in the style of the music. But I think that also you had mentioned something, that there's something that goes very back to the religion itself, that goes back to a quote from Ecclesiastes, that it is sort of what's playing underneath all of that music, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a time and there's a place for everything. There is a phrase that is attributed to King Solomon, we don't know really, but that say that too shall pass, right? There's a legend that he had this magical ring and the magic in it is just, if you have some wonderful joy and the ring would remind you that too shall pass. So it would intensify your joy and urge you to seize the moment. And if you go through hard times, and you have this very reminder, you know, that better times will be coming. So this is very much embedded in the culture, and probably in the duality of the experience itself, because it's, you know, it's just, especially at the time when, you know, there weren't so many, you know, secular Jews throughout the ages, you know, try to go and observe your 613 rules to live by and adapt to the daily life. So the experience of the duality of nature, I think all people experience, we all as human beings, right? We are consisting of both physical and spiritual nature. But I think when you're also away from your land and you are persecuted for your faith and you're not allowed to worship, and you have to face those choices every day, whether you know, die for your faith, or you secretly observe it, or you just decide that, you know, life is what's most important for you and you prefer to be assimilated or something. There's sort of a burden and a shade of people who are feel like they're being tasked with keep on going the mission, even away from their homeland, to pass on the tradition, to pass on the heritage, to pass on the way of their spiritual life, as they understand it, is much higher than the rules of the country that they would live in. So yeah, it is possible that this kind of duality that they face in everyday life is part of what makes the music what it is.
Right. Yeah. And there are some ways as well that some musical elements that are often integrated into Jewish music, like through different modes and things like that, that help a musician to kind of express those kinds of things. And would you mind kind of talking us through some of those elements as well?
Well, yes. I mean, essentially, spirituality and music is sort of the same. Not, I wouldn't say the same thing, but the fact that the Hebrew Bible is not read, is chanted. Right. So by default, it is music. You're supposed to use music to lead a service, or to read to chant everything that has a spiritual meaning. And so there were certain traditions that I think correlate to later European Western tradition. For example, you know, antiphonal worship, when a cantor would begin a phrase and the congregation would either repeat the same phrase or have its own answer that would complete the phrase. Right. Sort of a question and answer. The improvisatory nature of improvising on certain numbers of modes, Jewish scales. They are in the synagogue worship. You could say that, I mean, there are several modes. There are three main ones that are used for different events, different times, different, you know, the style is dictated by what you're trying to say and do in worship. Sometimes the way you would chant would be different, even according to the time of the day. But of course, these modes made it later into folk music, also in the secular music. And even today, I think some of these modes are distinctly recognizable as Jewish. If I had to pick one, it would probably be Ahava Rabbah. Okay, so for example, they have a Nagila that is universally recognized as, you know, one probably of the most famous folk Jewish dances, is written in this mode. Right. So yeah, and in an interesting way, I think it correlates with jazz. You know, just the fact that you have this mode, you have the scale, and off you go improvising on it. This is something that survived until today. Cantorial singing, and especially in the Orthodox synagogue, that does not allow instrumental playing during the service, is a cappella, and there's a lot of improvisation. Now, some of those improvisations or nusachs, they were written down, transcribed, and used as standards. But some allow for more liberty and flexibility and improvisation.
Right. Well, and some things that are chanted, like when you're chanting directly from the Torah, that's actually written into the language of the Torah, correct? Like there are notations to kind of understand how that part should be sung. It's part of the text.
These are cantillation marks. This is not an absolute notation in the sense that we understand from the music sheets that we read today. This is something that is part of oral tradition, but is also you would see if your voice should go up or down, some of more of a guideline marks, but it is not an absolute. Sure. It would also give some guidance to what the key phrase or the key word is, just by the sign that tells you to highlight certain word or sing it certain way.
And I think it's really interesting just to point out some similarities, even kind of how Judaism sort of integrated some elements, perhaps, and we don't know exactly, into the Christian worship service, the Christian liturgy, because as you mentioned,
the Gregorian chant, maybe, who knows? I mean, it's questionable.
Questionable, well, because
the concept,
they were drawing off of modes, right? So the music is from a different modality. We've got different things going on, but the tradition of chanting the Psalms, the antiphons, all of those things, we don't know for sure, but could potentially be some sort of linkage back. But of course, when we're looking at things from that time period, nothing was written down. We don't have a letter from Peter to Paul that says, hey, I really dig the use of chant in the liturgy. I think we should keep that part. And Paul's like, yeah, okay, cool, let's do it. Those things, we don't have them, they don't exist. So there's no way of knowing for certain, but there are some similarities, both in terms of that kind of crossover, because in other cultures, there doesn't seem to be that same tradition of chanting scripture. So it's possible. And then the other thing is the way that modes were kind of perceived. And of course, again, the Western church was using more Greek modes. So they're using basically a different alphabet to write the music. But both traditions seem to have a really strong sense that each mode had a emotional quality, and they were really sensitive to when they presented what different mode during what different service or what was happening in the liturgical year.
Absolutely, yes. The concept is very much similar, and I would give a lot to just travel back in a time machine and see and hear what the kind of orchestra they use. Actually, no, without even that sign, a real orchestra they used at the temple and choir, because we don't know what it was, but we know from the evidence, the scripture tells us that there were 12 pieces orchestra that had the string instruments, percussion instrument, wind instruments, and even some sort of an ancient organ, and 12 singers during the service at the temple. So this is, we know nothing about it. We know it existed. We can see images of some of the instruments, but this is a completely blank area, obviously. Yeah. We can't know what this was.
Yeah. How interesting.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So it gives so much to imagination. I think this is, something that allowed, Steve Reich to write his Tehillim and imagine whatever he imagined to be. And here we go,
Right.
Yes.
Fabulous. Yeah. I mean, it's really, there's a whole, we have this whole chunk of history that we know almost nothing about. And we, yes. And it's really fascinating. And of course, everything was oral tradition. So no one wrote it down, or whatever they wrote down might have gotten lost if it existed at any time at all. So yeah, it's going back that far is really difficult to see those relationships, because there's no concrete information or basis or whatever, but just these little tidbits that we get to put together or kind of draw conclusions from similarities.
Yes, this is a fascinating journey to take on, definitely.
Yeah.
and a difficult one. Very difficult, yeah.
Right. But there are definitely some things that have kind of stayed in the liturgy on both ends, right? Like we kind of talked about the Song of Moses or the Song of the Sea, right?
Yeah, mi chamocha in Hebrew, who is like you, oh God, yeah. Which
Yeah,
is also, yeah, again, it brings us to the highest meaning of music, you know, after the salvation, this miraculous salvation of the Israelites that happened, letting them, you know, parting the sea for them and then drowning the Egyptian army. What they do is they burst into a song. And this is the song of, yeah, this is the Mi Chamocha song.
right. And elements of that song tradition have stayed in various different aspects of Christianity as well. It stayed in like some Easter vigil services, especially in more like the Orthodox communities. So like again,
Yes,
we have, and that leads us to also, you know, I think one of the big influences that we have is of course the stories, right? These biblical stories that are present from Judaism, but that have integrated into Christianity and therefore into things like oratorio. And then you've got Handel setting these stories.
exactly, yeah.
You know, everybody is using those stories as the backdrop for the evolution of dramatic music.
Yes, well, we have Prince of Egypt, you know. We don't have to go that far back even, yeah.
Right. And so, and telling those stories actually is kind of what helped evolve Western music to a certain extent, I think, because, you know, especially when we're talking about like the Baroque era and things like that, they were not allowed to perform secular works during Lent. And so one of the ways that they had around that was to present oratorios. And it seems that the content for those oratorios usually focused on Old Testament biblical stories or the stories of the saints, because with the exception of the Passion works, it seemed like a lot of the New Testament was sort of off limits. Like you couldn't really touch that so much. There was something, you know, in the mentality that it was like kind of too sacred somehow to like get into. And even like Handel's Messiah was not well received at first because they felt like it touched too much on that. So in using the Jewish stories and using the stories of the saints, they were able to present dramatic music during the time of church year when secular music was not allowed.
Yeah, and since the Christianity recognizes the Old Testament as sort of a they see hints for all the events that happen in the New Testament in the Old Testament. So
Right.
there is it allowed to use as much from the Old Testament as written there. So that
Right.
sort of they use the same heritage, but in a very different way, since to deliver the same spiritual message in
Right.
Christian light, obviously.
Right, right. Which is an interesting subject into itself when talking about like religion and how these stories were adapted to represent a very different idea in the end. And of course, there's, you know, that's a very weighted conversation, I think, as well. But in terms of the way that it affected the music, it certainly allowed for the dramatic music to continue to evolve in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so those are the kind of the written traditions that we've got kind of working so far. But when it comes to um, Jewish music, I think integrating and being written down in a more cohesive way, or I guess in a more modern way, I think that brings us more or less to someone like Joel Engel in the 1800s.
Yes, this was a part of sort of rebirth of strong interest of composers in their own Jewish tradition, the nationalistic movement. I think it was about the same time, somewhat after the big Russian nationalistic movement, the Mighty Five of the Russians. And as Eastern Europe were composers, they were looking for using more and more of folk music, Dvořák, for example, yes. And, that was the time where the Jewish composers ethnically Jewish composers, no matter if they were secular by that time or had more affinity to religion, they had this revived interest in that. I think it might have also do with the Zionistic movement. The self-awareness of a nation. So yeah, this is an interesting case really with the group that Engel actually formed, and his story is interesting because Joel Engel was known from those Jews who lived in a shtetl. He was perfectly, totally assimilated, culturally Russian, yes, ethnically Jewish, but completely secular, had nothing to do with the Pale of Settlement. He was a Tchaikovsky protege. By Tchaikovsky recommendation, he was accepted into Moscow Conservatory, went on a very successful career, right, as a major Russian composer, writing, Russian music style, and a critic, and really a prominent figure. And the story has it that when he was talking with one of his Russian colleagues, he was confronted with the fact, well, why don't you take pride in your people? Why do you strive to write Russian national music? Where is your pride in your own people? Where is your interest in your own folk traditions? And apparently this was a point of no return for him. And it ended up with something that is probably one of the most significant projects in recent history, because what he did, he established this society of composers that made it a mission to collect folk Yiddish songs that were available, and not only that, to publish works that would be based on those Yiddish songs. So it's in parallel to what other Eastern European composers did as well. I understand that they took a phonograph recently, the recent invention by Edison, and went to all the villages and made it possible for us to actually have access to the heritage by collecting those songs and publicizing volumes and volumes of folk music, and also bringing this folk music to the concert stage, incorporating it, blending it with the classical traditional writing.
Right. And just to clarify, a lot of those same modes that are used in the liturgical music are often used also in the folk music as well, right?
Sometimes yes, or sometimes there was also a Hasidic movement that this is a much later movement that sort of developed its own tradition. And their klezmer music is essentially secular. It's just dance music for weddings, for all sort of simchas, happy occurrences in the cycle of life, so to speak. So I believe it correlates in some places, but in other ways it is also developed its own flavor, so to speak. And as we mentioned earlier, also mixed with the flavor of the local tradition. There's a lot of similarities between Jewish music in Russia and music of Russian gypsies, for example. So what they did, though, they presented it in a concert setting. They wrote concert pieces that would incorporate those folk tunes.
Right. And then it was really
had it performed, so to bring it to raise the awareness of the heritage.
Right, which was really instrumental in a couple ways. I mean, first of all, it kind of set a baseline that they started to create all these like Jewish societies of Jewish music. So that was the first time that those things started to really, I think,
and publications to transcribe those and have it publicized. Yes.
Right. And yeah, exactly. Once they had things published, then it's sort of, having things written down sort of opened the door to other composers from other cultures being able to look at that music and then grow their own compositions from them. So like, for example, Prokofiev and Ravel both used Engel's works as a baseline for different pieces that they created as well. So
Yes.
it was kind of this really huge, like just having it written down the way that it was sort of opened the door up to a lot more integration between the cultures musically.
Yes, this was a critical project that we all are indebted to right now for preservation of the culture, for actually doing that. And it took someone like him uh, uh, to be able to pull this off. It took someone, a figure of that kind of an influence, who can make this happen.
Well, and his story is interesting as well because he started in Russia in the early 1900s. And then after, like, I believe it was when the Bolsheviks took over, he moved to Berlin and then started setting up Jewish music societies
There, yes, yeah,
there. And then after a while there, obviously things were not taking a great turn. And so then he moved down to what at that point was still British Palestine. He moved down to Israel and started to think like, okay, what now we're in the Holy Land, so now we need. He started writing new folk songs and new children's songs because he felt like in this place we need a different Jewish folk song tradition, and so actually
yes.
he kind of integrated into that world as well.
A lot of first Israeli composers of a newly reestablished Israel were preoccupied later with that idea of, okay, what is actually a new Israeli music? We don't want to be, perceived as, victimized people of the past. This is, a new world. This is us. What do we do? And music of art music of first Israeli composers such as Paul Ben Haim or Mark Lover, it reflects this kind of I wouldn't say struggle, but you could see this journey in their work,
Yeah.
that they are trying. Of course, they're classically trained, but they're also trying to have this combination of East and West and Mediterranean sound, that they're trying to create this unique sound to go probably away from classical tradition that they were very much raised on, and incorporate what would be new Israeli music for the new Israeli state. And that journey in itself is very interesting, how the synthesis that they came up with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that seems to be, and we've mentioned it before, that seems to be the one of the kind of marking points or one of the elements that is the thread that runs through all of Jewish music is this back and forth between like the culture that is Jewish and then the culture that you're in. And even when you're in Israel, that's its own thing.
Yes. Okay, now we're here. What do we do? Yes.
Exactly. And so that's led to some really amazing works of music too, and composers have found, like you said, like there's this duality of, even when we're happy, there's always a sad kind of tone to it, all of those kinds of elements, but also you can hear it pretty distinctly in some turn of the century music like Mahler, right? Who started to really, he was quite, I think, conflicted about this issue and has a really interesting story and some really interesting musical moments as well. For those of you who don't know the story of Mahler, he grew up Jewish and then he basically had to convert to Christianity in order to get to conduct in Germany at the time. And so he technically had converted to Christianity, but you kind of sense through his music that there's this push and pull, and there's a real, sort of angst over having made that decision. And people look at his music and say, like, does he have still elements of Jewish musicality in his concert pieces? And there's certainly an argument that there does, right? Especially with the funeral march, I think, is the main one, even though there's other aspects of that as well.
Yeah, it just segues into klezmer tune right there, right from you. There was no, yes, this is only
Right.
someone like Mahler who could
But
do something like that.
the baseline of it is basically Frère Jacques.
Yes, in minor. Yes.
Yeah. So that's the funeral march. And then all of a sudden you get this klezmer music that's introduced over it or, back and forth between it.
Yes, it has almost a cinematic effect. You can imagine it, like just being, seeing those cultures living side by side. There is a procession that meets another group of people who, the duality of it, and the two cultures that kind of, correlate and live together. One a major one, and another one that is a subculture, so to speak. Yes. I don't know for myself. I did not go into asking myself, some people say that he was forced, like many others, to convert in order to secure some position that, would provide for his living. Some people think that he was genuinely torn between those two identities, and as the music reflects this kind of try to bring those together in his work as well. I wouldn't make any kind of statement at this point, because it baffles people who are much more of a Mahler scholars than myself.
Right. Well, and I think too, of course, music is always subjective. And so people see in it what they want to see. Because even in the instance of this funeral march, there are lots of scholars who would say, oh, that's not klezmer. That's like a Hungarian folk tune or something like that, trying to attribute it to something else. Because people want to see what they want to see in it to a certain extent,
Well, I would disagree with that, because even the instrumentation of this klezmer tune indicates that was deliberately the intention.
Right, because it's highly, it's a lot of oboe.
Yeah, yes, and clarinet in this, and other instrumentations that kind of probably is trying to imitate the klezmer band sound.
Right. So yeah, so it's just interesting, to look at someone like Mahler and yeah, of course, it's difficult to come up with any definitive conclusions, because once again, he didn't write his personal letters that we know everything that he thought at every moment.
Yeah. But again, I would think that the experience of being born Jewish and facing the struggles and his personal life difficulties, everything obviously contributes to what the music is like. But Mahler, I think, was among those figures who had a major influence on Shostakovich. Even though Shostakovich wasn't Jewish, but he found so much inspiration in that mastery with which Mahler could bring together the sublime and the grotesque, the high and the low. It kind of lives side by side, the two cultures that blend in his symphonies, in his world. All these struggles, personal struggles that he went through, everything is so vividly and so masterfully done in his work. And in that sense of bringing folk music and then into the concert stage, and having, we have some of the greatest symphonies now that utilize those themes. Shostakovich, I think his biggest piece that kind of commemorates the tragical Jewish event is the Babi Yar, the 13th symphony, where he took up upon, and that was absolutely his choice and his sort of, I wouldn't say dream, but something that he wanted to deliberately do, even though this is not something that was welcomed. To write something like that. This is definitely a huge statement and a risky one, and he did it anyway. But even before that, in 1948, all of a sudden he decided to write. Well, actually, nothing is all of a sudden. And of course, there were things that preceded the decision. But out of all things, to take folk Yiddish poetry and write a piece after that. 1948. It's impossible to even put on stage. Even writing something like that is a statement that can cost you a career and more.
Right.
Okay, in life understanding. And it was not performed until not on public stage until 1955. But Shostakovich considered himself obliged, he felt an obligation, an inner obligation, to defend the defenseless.
Right.
And being a humanist, great humanist as he was, So he did it in the way that he was most capable of doing, in a musical way, to make this statements, to be the voice for the people who needed to be defended by the oppression.
Right.
So, but all of this wouldn't have been probably as of so much importance if these weren't masterpieces of world literature. So, the reason that we talk about this today, I think it's because these are staples of world classical music repertoire.
Right.
And I think this is what makes it so significant.
Right. Well, and I'm curious to see, because these people that we're talking about, like Mahler is turn of the century, Shostakovich is World War II and post World War II and all of that, and of course at that time there was huge historical things happening, obviously with the Holocaust and with all of those things that were changing the world completely, and that of course very immediately affected Jewish culture. And it seems like now we kind of got out of that particular scenario, right? And like a lot of Jewish people emigrated to America and started lives there. And so then now we've got all of this great Jewish music that's happening in America. Like if you look at composers like Copland and Bernstein, and even people like Kurt Weill, or going off of the classical music trajectory into Irving Berlin and all of this stuff. And I'm just curious how you see the Jewish influence in, these American composers in this, post.
I mean, well, Broadway, I mean, there were so many Jewish immigrants, but, and the Yiddish theater, so many tunes that kind of, derived from that, the contribution that they made. It is a huge scene, so it's hard even to pick one. You listed a few. Yes. So yeah, I mean, the Son of a Cantor, Irving Berlin is one of these figures, but there are just too many
Right.
to even list.
Gershwin.
Then yes, yeah. And on concert stage composers such as Copland and Bernstein, that are very American, but also wrote Jewish pieces like the Vitebsk trio that Copland wrote, based on the tune that haunted him, on the folk Jewish tune that he heard. And so he, I think he named the trio Vitebsk because the tune originated from that. And this is what correlates with what you mentioned about, thanks to Joel Engel, he was exposed to that tune that he heard probably during the performance of the play Die Book. And again, something like this was influencing him deeply, thanks to the effort of the folk music Jewish group that was headed by Engel in St. Petersburg in Russia. So through that, it had a possibility to spread over the world and have American composer such as Copland be taken by it and creating a masterpiece of his own, using this.
Yeah. Well, and he's interesting as well, because he also kind of shares this duality of two homelands, right? Because you've got that piece that pulls from Jewish folk tunes, but then also he is
Appalachian Spring, exactly,
which is the most American, like that is the quintessential, like American sounding American orchestral piece. That when we talk about American music, it's like one of the first things that comes up, right? So then you've got the other side of him, and he didn't really integrate those two on top of each other like someone like Mahler had done. He kind of, it seems like he sort of kept them a little bit more separate.
I feel that probably in America, he did not have this sort of, it's much more comfortable to kind of spell out everything that what's important to you, and you can be perfectly American and Jewish and without having to come to terms, being converted into something. We're talking about a much modern time, or I mean, being, having a faith conversion, or having to denounce your heritage in hope that it will, help you with your career, or being deliberately told to do so. So I think what's allowed for concert music to flourish, and also someone like Bernstein, who could write Kaddish, who could write many employ many Jewish themes without any kind of need to look back, and to look over your shoulder. This is
right.
This is very different scene, very different time, luckily.
Yes.
And be completely American. I think this is probably the success of the American idea. You could be who you are and also be absolutely American in every sense of the word.
Yeah.
At least that's my hope.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think all of the composers that we just pointed out, music that are very thoroughly American music, like
or you could write God Bless America, and you could write White Christmas and be who you are, and no one tells you, why is that?
right.
Yes, this is something that I hope will continue.
Yeah, me too. Which sort of brings us to you.
Oh. Which is more difficult. Of course, it's easier to babble about Bernstein than to talk about yourself.
But I mean, here we are in America, right? And you've written so many different types of music, from Broadway to classical and art song, and then your opera Shulamit, which sort of combines some classical elements with some more Jewish stylistic music. So you've been in the center of all of this as well, and that's kind of what you're describing, right? Is that you can be all of these things.
I hope so. Yes, in the free world. That's what's supposed to happen. I believe so. I mean, of course, being Jewish, sometimes I would deliberately write Jewish music or write on Jewish themes because I'm inspired by it, but I don't, obviously I'm just a composer of concert and Broadway music, and it is Jewish inspired or Jewish themed music or liturgy music, that I wrote for Reform synagogues here in the United States. This is a big part of what I do, and some things are conscious, some things are unconscious. They just kind of run in my blood, being by just by nature. But yes, I think you could be all of these things, and I don't see myself as a Jewish composer just because of my ethnicity and origin. I'm a composer who also has certain affinity and certain background. So whenever it inspires me, that's what I do as part of my work. And the blend is, you would think, I'm a citizen of Israel, yes, and the overall Russian background. But I remember myself waking up as a kid, living in Azerbaijan, Baku, which is a Muslim republic, right? When the Soviet Union crashed, and Azerbaijan, as all other republics, were on the way of their own sort of awareness, a newly found awareness of their national roots. All of a sudden, I wake up to the sounds of the muezzin on the mosque. Every morning I would hear this kind of music that also goes into my psyche. That's actually very beautiful. I mean, as hard as it is to appreciate it, that's like at 5 a.m. in the morning, which is the first call to worship that newly found Azerbaijan, found the right thing to do in the middle of the city. But being a kid, you're being raised on, you kind of absorb everything that you hear. So I think that my music is a synthesis of a classical upbringing and my life in Israel and the Mediterranean modes that you experienced in Shulamit, the jazz, the Broadway tradition that I'm very much inspired by and utilize in my work.
Yeah, that's fabulous. And I think a lot of great composers have had that same experience, right? That and that's what makes music, and especially multi-dimensional, ethnic backgroundy music, so interesting to listen to, is that we live in a world where we're almost never just like one thing. There's always all these different elements that are on play, whether it's from our own culture or from the culture right next door or whatever. And this really beautiful integration of all of those things and all of the different ways you get to express them.
Yes, I agree. And the world has become so small, and we all have access to everything. Basically, it's I think in today's world is less about struggling to find something but making choices from all the information that you hear, from all the vast majority of influences that you are in the middle of.
Yeah.
And how you navigate your way through everything that's available to you.
Right. Well, I know you have some music projects that are coming up here. You have a video opera that's happening soon, right?
I wrote music, yes, for it's a commission by Bear Opera. It is an opera about simple New Yorkers, of the kind that we are, and we meet on streets, with libretto by Brianna Hunter. And this is going to be a film opera. It's going to come out in October. And it's a part of the Decameron Opera Coalition Project Festival, where each independent, selected independent opera company from a certain city presents an opera about heroes, the unsung heroes of their city. And when we were thinking about who are we going to pick as unsung heroes of New York, again, there were so many that we decided that actually the heroes of New York are everyday people, everyday simple New Yorkers that you meet, your neighbor, someone who sits next to you on a subway, sometimes someone who cuts your way on the street. We talk about those New York heroes, and I won't say anymore. Okay. I hope you watch it when it comes out in October.
Well, can I ask a little bit what the pull of the musical influence is? Is it more Broadway, classical?
It is heavily influenced by musical theater. Mm-hmm. It also has I'll give it away. It does have one character that is utilizing Jewish music, being by what the character is. Sure. Okay. And yes, but it calls for operatic capabilities. So the style it kind of straddles the line between opera and musical theater.
Oh, great.
Can only be done by singers with operatic training, but is very theatrical in nature.
Yeah. Fabulous. Well, I will definitely put a link to information about that in the description below so that so we don't miss that and we can get to hear some more of Dina's music. But for today, I think we were going to end with some music from Shulamit. So I wonder if you would tell us a little bit more about that particular opera, which, like we said, was like probably the last time that we got to see each other in person was performing Shulamit.
Shulamit grew out of my fascination with the original poetry of the Song of Songs and the text of Ecclesiastes. And that was, initially it was just kind of a love project that I was lucky to be produced several times and then be taken to other places, such Aspen Music Festival and others, against all odds, because when I was submitting it to Aspen, I'm like, who is going to put up the Hebrew opera and biblical subject? But here we are. What can I say? I mean, it's better to hear the piece than to talk about this, but the particular, I think, segment that you are going to put up, Ashkevenu, is something that I incorporated later in the opera. But initially, the text is a real prayer. It's an evening prayer, basically asking God to let us sleep in peace and wake up alive and safe the next day. And the prayer goes on with, please spread your shelter of peace over us, and ends with a blessing, Baruch Atah Adonai, blessed you are, O God. So yes, originally this is something that was commissioned by a synagogue, and by the libretto of my opera, I thought it was appropriate to put it there, and it kind of fits in very nicely according to the
Right.
reaction of people who heard it. The opera is dear to me because it was, I written it. The first production was in 2014. I wrote it. I started writing it in 2012 and just kind of living with it for a while, since it, I wasn't limited by any kind of deadline or like commissioning limitation. This is a very freedom kind of project that is very dear to me that way.
Yeah. And the storyline comes from biblical characters as well, right?
Actually, no, because the original Song of Songs does not have a particular storyline. It's a collection of poems. They share certain same characters. Some characters repeat throughout. Some poetic texts you see connection, but sometimes you don't. I mean, and sometimes it's even not possible to truly say who is talking to whom. But the poetry itself is sublime. And even if you don't have any spiritual religious background, I was simply hypnotized by the text from the very first encounter with it. And those gaps in the text allow again for different kinds of interpretation. And so this is what I did. I basically used the original text from the Song of Songs and the Ecclesiastes, and I used them as bricks to build my libretto around them and to fill in the gaps into a storyline, which is my original storyline. Because Shulamit herself, Shulamit is someone who is just appears only once in the last song of the Song of Songs, and that's all. In text that says Shuvi Shuvi Shulamit, turn Shulamit, so it's probably some scene of dancing around it, and that's all.
Yeah, and it's a beautifully told story that integrates all of these different kind of musical elements. I feel like there are even some things that feel a little bit more musical theater, Broadway, even in the midst of this story. And the story you created revolves around King Solomon and his relationship with this woman Shulamit.
Exactly. This is actually, it's called Shulamit, but this is essentially a story of a journey of King Solomon. And Shulamit comes as a wake up. Everything that she does and says to him is kind of like a wake up call to him at the point of his life where he, seen it all, had it all, and definitely, and yet he does not feel an inner reason to keep on going, so to speak, in a very difficult inner point of his life. The music is intentionally different. We have two worlds in the beginning of the opera. So Shulamit, her beloved, her friends. This is where I utilize Mediterranean modes and more what you would think of Israeli music of today. The world of King Solomon is more westernized. There's jazzy undertones. So we have the kingdom of Solomon and that world in the beginning of the opera as a sort of a hint of juxtaposition between the two worlds. And as his journey progresses, the music changes as well.
Right. Yeah. And then you've got this beautiful Hashkivenu it's sort of in the middle of the piece after Shulamit has been captured and her friends say the Hashkivenu as a prayer to keep them.
Yes. Yeah. At the moment of desperation, Shulamit is in great danger without going into too much details, and her friends are in a great danger too. And so their prayer for God as the only one to save them and let them spend the night in peace and wake up alive the next day. This is the context where it comes in opera.
Right. Wonderful. Well, I'm really looking forward to sharing it with everyone. It's a beautiful piece, and it's one that I think is, again, it doesn't matter what your cultural or religious or whatever background is. It's so beautifully set, and it's a beautiful quartet that I think just speaks to everyone. So I hope you will enjoy getting to hear that in a bit. And I just wanted to say Thank you to Dina for joining us today and for all of the wonderful information that you've shared and the perspective that you brought, and it's been really fascinating and interesting.
Thank you so much for having me, Angie. And are you going to tell us who the performers are in this quartet?
Yeah.
Or do you keep it a secret?
Well, their names, and if they have websites, I'll put links below. But in this piece, we have myself, we have Laura Reaper as our alto, we have Red Horowitz singing the tenor part, and then the bass line is Stan Lacey, all who are phenomenal singers and that I actually get to sing with in a church. So that's how we all know each other, and they were really wonderful in joining me on this and lending me their voices, and so that's what we'll hear in the recording. Thank you all so much for watching, and many, many, many thanks to the wonderful Dina Pruzhansky for joining us today. It was really wonderful to talk through these things with you, and it's been a pleasure, collecting all of this material and gaining this deeper understanding. I hope you all enjoyed this video and getting to hear some of Dina's music. If you did, you know what to do. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, push all the fun buttons, including that little notification bell so you don't miss our next video. And we will see you next time.